My name's James Wood. I work at the Department of Veterinary Medicine here in Cambridge University, and I work. Most of my research is on infectious and zoonotic diseases of animals, so those infections that can spread from animals to humans. And I work in the UK, but also quite a lot in sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit in India as well. I'm also quite involved in both, certainly in the UK and Ethiopia, which is one of the countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I work on evidence-based policy in relation to disease control. And so what I don't want to do, what I don't want to talk about this evening is about animal disease, although animal disease is really important. But I just want to talk a little bit in relation to animal contributions to climate change. And there's been a lot of publicity from the IPCC report earlier this year, but also there's a growing amount of work being done, actually some of it quite good at DEFRA in relation to trying to mitigate the effects of carbon usage and moving towards a carbon neutral economy. One thing I think that there is fairly clear evidence about is that around 10% of the contribution that we make in the British society to climate change comes from agriculture. Right? So we're in terms of food production, and actually quite a lot of that 10% comes from methane production from ruminants. So everyone talks about cows farting, but actually it's cows and sheep and other animals with rumens. But in this country it's mostly cows and sheep. It comes from their burping, and it comes from the anaerobic digestion of fibrous food in the rumen of cattle and sheep. They've always done that, but and so you might say, well, actually, what we've got to do is cut down on the amounts of carbon usage which have changed, which have driven human-mediated climate change. But actually, if this is something that we can impact on through agriculture as well, then I think there's no question that we should be looking to do that. Now, there are all sorts of different responses to this, and I want to. It's very important to see the global context for this, but I think it's also quite interesting to look at it from the British context. In contrast to a lot of meat production in Brazil, in contrast to a lot of meat production in China, a lot of ruminant production in the UK is on grassland. And actually, a lot of it is upland areas and areas which are not suitable either for soya production, or for wheat production, or for growing pigs. But it is possible to farm ruminants in upland areas, sheep and cattle on the hills of Scotland, Wales, and England. And I think what's interesting to think about in relation to ruminant production is that it underpins a huge amount of the landscapes that we claim to be British and many of us love. And also ruminant production underpins a lot of the local communities living in remote areas, upland areas, but not just upland areas. And if we are to move from away from ruminant production, which many people, for good reasons, if you look at sums on a calculation about contribution to climate change, there is an argument for moving away from ruminant consumption. Then within Britain, then we can expect to see the landscapes that we love, and like the Lake District, some of the Highlands of Scotland, they are shaped by ruminant production. So some people will tell you that we should be growing forests there instead, and sustainable forests. In terms of straight carbon exchange, well, that would make a positive contribution to the carbon economy, whereas ruminants at the moment are somewhat of a cost. But I think that there's a really difficult. I think that's an oversimplified approach to things, and I think that if you look at institutional responses to the realization that ruminants are in some ways problematic, and I think that if you look at buying your beef from Brazil, some of which has been fed on soybeans, then you can make there's a direct correlation. Whereas if you look at grass-fed ruminants produced locally in Britain, and then although they're inefficient users of land when you look at production per hectare, which is another criticism of ruminant production, and it would be a criticism of ruminant production in Britain as well. I think if you look at those sums, they don't take into account that you can't, other than a bit of forest, or actually quite a lot of forest, you can't grow other things in many parts of those highland and upland areas. And so treating one hectare of land in the Fens as the same as 1 hectare of lands in West Argyll, in other parts of Scotland, is a gross oversimplification. And I think that's something in relation to choices that we might take in this country, which is where I want to think. I'm trying to bring the conversation back to, as well as recognising the global context for it. I think it's really interesting to think about ways that you could continue to support the practices in some of those local economies to sustain the landscapes that we might choose to collectively in society to sustain in this country. But I think we should do this in a way that is thought through in as carbon neutral a way as we can. And I think that it's exciting that research is delivering is not yet delivering, but has some promises in relation to reducing methane production from cattle and sheep. And that might be by the means of boluses that can sit and release chemicals slowly into the methane, which are safe in terms of our food production, safe for the animals, but also they have the potential to dramatically reduce the amount of methane that are being produced from grass-fed animals, or even animals that are being fed more intensively. So I think that I've received personally quite a lot of criticism from the National Farmers Union for not stopping the university move towards a policy of not selling any beef and lamb in its food outlets, and I think that that policy might be quite hard to change, but I think that there's not yet been enough discussion about locally and sustainably sourced ruminant usage, which takes into account the fact that all land is not the same, but those discussions are not yet been had. So I think there are good reasons for us in society thinking about the amount of meat that we eat. But I think at the same time, there is we should think very carefully about the impact of the choices that we take on the countryside that many of us are really interested in trying to sustain the good elements of. But I think at the same time we've got to recognise that we've got to do more to mitigate some of the less attractive elements or the less positive elements of agricultural production. Thank you.